On June 19, 2015, a family camping trip in the mountains of southern Arizona turned into a nightmare that would haunt the Castrejon family for years to come. What should have been a peaceful weekend in nature became one of the most perplexing disappearance cases in the region, a mystery that raises more questions than answers even today. Janet Castrejon was 44 years old when she vanished without a trace from Rustler Park Campground in the Chiricahua Mountains. But to understand what happened that day and why this case is so deeply troubling, you need to know Janet's story. 27 years earlier, when Janet was just 18 years old and finishing her first semester studying computer science at New Mexico State University, her life changed forever. A car accident in 1988 left her in a coma for 3 months. When she finally woke up, she faced a new reality. The traumatic brain injury had caused memory problems and partial blindness. Janet, who had been an independent young woman with her whole future ahead of her, now needed constant care and supervision from her parents. Despite these challenges, Janet's family never gave up on her. Her parents, Dr. Eduardo and Lydia Castrejon, devoted themselves to caring for their oldest daughter. They lived together in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and Janet remained completely dependent on them for her daily needs. The family was close-knit, with Janet's 3 siblings always nearby and involved in her life. So when Eduardo and Lydia decided to take Janet on a camping trip that June, it was meant to be a special time together, a chance to enjoy the beauty of the mountains as a family. The Chiricahua Mountains in southern Arizona are stunning. Rustler Park sits high in these mountains, a wildflower-carpeted meadow surrounded by Douglas fir and ponderosa pine trees. It's the kind of place that takes your breath away, peaceful and remote, where black bears roam freely and hiking trails wind through the wilderness. The campsites are deliberately scattered along access roads that skirt the meadow, designed to protect the fragile plants and soil. It's beautiful, but it's also isolated. On Thursday, June 18th, the Castrejon family left their home in Las Cruces and began their journey. They drove their motor home to Deming, where they stopped at a church and spent the night. The next morning, Friday the 19th, they had breakfast at an IHOP before continuing on to Arizona. Everything was going according to plan. They arrived at Rustler Park Campground sometime between 1:30 and 2 in the afternoon. The family took their time setting up camp, getting everything arranged just right. It wasn't until around 4 o'clock that Eduardo prepared lunch for everyone, making quesadillas, beans, and rice. They ate together, enjoying their meal in the mountain air. At this point, everything was normal. Everything was fine. But in just over an hour, their lives would be turned upside down. Around 5 o'clock, after they'd finished eating, Lydia told her husband and daughter that she wanted to go for a walk. She asked Janet to come with her. At first, Janet declined, but Eduardo had a practical suggestion. He told Janet to go with her mother to the pay station to drop off their camping fee payment. Janet agreed, and the 2 women set off together. The walk from their motorhome to the pay station was only about 1,000 feet, following a curved path through the campground. Janet deposited the payment envelope while her mother waited nearby. Then they continued walking. About 300 feet past the pay station, Lydia decided she needed to use the bathroom. Janet waited outside for her mother. This is the last time anyone would see Janet Castrejon alive. When Lydia came out of the bathroom, just a few minutes later, Janet was gone. At first, Lydia wasn't too concerned. She assumed Janet had simply decided to walk back to Eduardo on her own. But when Lydia returned to the motorhome and found that Janet wasn't there, panic set in immediately. Eduardo was at the campsite. He had been there the whole time, and he had never seen Janet return. Think about this for a moment. Janet had been standing right outside the bathroom, waiting for her mother. The bathroom visit lasted only a few minutes. In that brief window of time, Janet disappeared completely. Eduardo immediately confirmed that Janet had never made it back to their campsite. The family began searching frantically, asking other campers if they had seen her. But no one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Janet had simply vanished. The family searched the area desperately, looking for any sign of their daughter and sister. There were no footprints leading off the main path. There were no signs of a struggle that might suggest Janet had been attacked or tried to fight someone off. There were no screams, no cries for help, nothing. It was as if Janet had been plucked from the spot where she stood and removed from existence. As the hours passed and Janet didn't appear, the family's fear grew. By 8 o'clock that evening, Janet's brother Oscar arrived at the campground and called 911 to report his sister missing. But here's where the story takes another frustrating turn. Help didn't arrive until after midnight, early Saturday morning on June 20th. Oscar later said that a search and rescue team from the Cochise County Sheriff's Office didn't begin searching until around 12:30 in the morning. They searched until 6 a.m., took a break, and resumed around 9 a.m. A search helicopter was brought in later that day, flying over the area looking for any trace of Janet, but the helicopter found nothing. The search continued through Sunday and into the following days. Search and rescue teams on foot, accompanied by sniffer dogs, thoroughly combed the area around Rustler Park Campground. They found no sign of Janet, no evidence of clothing, no blood that might indicate a bear attack, which was a real possibility in an area where black bears are frequently spotted. It was as if Janet had never been there at all. The Castrejon family was convinced that Janet had been abducted. Her brother Fabian was particularly vocal about his frustrations with the search efforts. He believed there wasn't enough effort from the beginning, and he pointed out that a search team from New Mexico had offered to help but was rejected by the Cochise County authorities. Fabian took on a leadership role in the search, often finding tips and leads that he would bring to the detectives assigned to the case. He spent about 3 weeks searching for Janet immediately after her disappearance, and he helped organize extensive search parties. He and his sister Xochitl regularly searched the area until the park closed for the season in late October. Oscar, meanwhile, had a different frustration with the investigation. He believed the search was hindered because authorities didn't properly take into account Janet's disabilities. He felt they assumed too quickly that Janet was competent and capable of making her own decisions. Oscar said the authorities told the family that Janet either left with someone or ran away. But the family knew this made no sense. They had specifically told investigators that Janet was disabled and wasn't capable of many things. She was completely dependent on her parents. The idea that she would simply wander off or leave with a stranger didn't align with who Janet was or what she was capable of. The detectives working the case didn't have any particular theory about what happened to Janet. But Fabian had strong opinions about the possibilities. He pointed out that there was no way Janet could have strayed too far on her own. The campground was landlocked, meaning the only way to get out was the same way you came in. There was no real cliff she could have fallen off, no river where she could have drowned. Based on these facts, Fabian believed that somebody took her out of the campground, or that she got into a car with someone. But who would have taken her, and why? Janet was a vulnerable woman with significant disabilities. She wasn't someone who would have willingly gone with a stranger. And if someone had tried to force her, surely there would have been some sign of a struggle, some sound that would have alerted nearby campers. The lack of any evidence made the case even more baffling. It's worth noting that the Chiricahua Mountains area has a history of strange disappearances. Another case that haunts the region involves Paul Fugate, a law enforcement ranger who vanished on Sunday, January 13, 1980. Paul was 41 years old when he left the visitor center at Chiricahua National Monument to check the nature trail. He was never seen again. Like Janet's case, Paul's disappearance left investigators with more questions than answers. What is it about this area that seems to swallow people whole? For 3 years, the Castrejon family lived with the agony of not knowing what happened to Janet. They continued to search, continued to hope, continued to demand answers, and then, on August 5, 2018, a hiker named Amanda Moores made a discovery that would finally bring some closure to the family, though it would also raise new questions. Amanda found bone fragments and a braid of hair in the mountains. The location was only about a mile from where Janet was last seen at the campground. The Cochise County Sheriff's Office took possession of the remains, and they were sent to the Tucson Medical Examiner's Office for analysis. The process took over a year, but in September 2019, the results came back. The DNA was a match. The remains belonged to Janet Castrejon. The medical examiner found no evidence of foul play. This official conclusion suggests that Janet died from natural causes, possibly exposure to the elements. But this finding doesn't answer the fundamental questions that have plagued this case from the beginning. How did Janet end up a mile away from where she was last seen? Remember, she had been standing right outside the bathroom, waiting for her mother. She had significant disabilities that made her dependent on her parents. She had memory problems and partial blindness. The idea that she simply wandered off and walked a mile through unfamiliar, rugged terrain doesn't make sense to those who knew her. If Janet did wander off on her own, why didn't the search dogs pick up her scent? Why didn't the helicopter spot her? Why were there no footprints leading away from the bathroom area? And if she was only a mile away, why didn't she respond to the searchers who were calling her name? These questions remain unanswered. Some might argue that Janet became disoriented and confused, that her brain injury caused her to wander without understanding where she was going. But her family insists this doesn't fit with Janet's capabilities and limitations. They knew her better than anyone, and they maintain that she couldn't have done this on her own. The alternative explanation, that someone took Janet from outside that bathroom, also presents problems. If someone abducted her, how did they do it so quickly and quietly? How did they leave no evidence? And why would they take her only to leave her a mile away? Unless, of course, something happened during the abduction that caused the perpetrator to abandon Janet in the wilderness. But again, there's no evidence to support this theory. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened to Janet Castrejon on that June afternoon in 2015. What we do know is that a vulnerable woman disappeared in a matter of minutes from a public campground, that extensive searches found nothing for 3 years, and that her remains were eventually discovered close enough to the campground that it seems impossible she wasn't found sooner. Janet's case reminds us of how quickly tragedy can strike, even in places that seem safe and peaceful. It reminds us that there are still mysteries in this world that defy explanation, disappearances that leave families without closure, questions that remain unanswered despite our best efforts to find the truth. The Castrejon family waited 3 years to learn that Janet had died, but they may wait forever to understand how and why it happened. And somewhere in the beautiful, haunting Chiricahua Mountains, the answers to those questions remain hidden, perhaps forever lost to the wilderness that claimed Janet's life. In the autumn of 1928, a newly married couple embarked on what should have been the adventure of a lifetime. Glen and Bessie Hyde set off on their honeymoon down the Green and Colorado rivers, navigating through the heart of the Grand Canyon in a homemade wooden boat. They were young, in love, and chasing both a world record and a place in history. But somewhere in the depths of that ancient canyon, they vanished without a trace, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries in American outdoor history. To understand what happened to Glen and Bessie Hyde, we need to go back to where their story began. The couple had met just a year earlier in 1927 on a passenger ship traveling to Los Angeles. It was one of those chance encounters that seemed destined to be. They fell in love quickly, and by April 12, 1928, they were married. Glen was an experienced outdoorsman and expert boat builder who had already conquered the Salmon and Snake Rivers in Idaho. Bessie, on the other hand, was 22 years old, an aspiring artist with a bohemian spirit, but she had no experience with rivers or rapids whatsoever. Glen had a dream. He wanted to set a new speed record for running the Grand Canyon, and he wanted Bessie to become the first documented woman to successfully navigate its treacherous waters. It wasn't just about the adventure. According to historical records, the couple planned to complete the journey and then go on the lecture circuit, making money by retelling their incredible story to audiences across the country. It was an ambitious plan, but Glen was confident in his abilities and in the boat he had built with his own hands. The vessel they would use was a 20-foot-long wooden sweep scow that Glen had constructed himself. He named it Rain in the Face. Now, a scow is essentially a type of flat-bottom barge, and while Glen's craftsmanship was solid, this was not the kind of boat most people would choose for tackling some of the most dangerous rapids in North America. But Glen believed in his design, and Bessie believed in Glen. On October 20th, 1928, the Hydes began their journey in Green River, Utah. They estimated the entire trip would take no more than a month and a half. Keep in mind, this was a very different era. The Grand Canyon had no commercial river trips at the time. The rapids were the domain of seasoned explorers and professional expeditions. Safety standards were nothing like they are today. Glen and Bessie wore no life jackets. They had no specialist wet weather gear. They were essentially navigating one of the world's most dangerous waterways with minimal safety equipment and a homemade boat. Early in the trip, the dangers became immediately apparent. Glen fell out of the boat while navigating a rapid. Fortunately, he managed to get back in, but it was a stark reminder of just how perilous their journey was. Still, they pressed on, successfully navigating many of the major rapids of the Green and Colorado rivers. For nearly a month, everything seemed to be going according to plan. On November 16th, almost a month into their adventure, Glen and Bessie arrived at Grand Canyon Village on the South Rim. They spent a few days there, restocking their supplies and taking a brief respite from the river. While there, they spoke with a reporter from the Denver Post, confidently telling him that their final destination of Needles, California, was just a few weeks away. They were in good spirits, excited about completing their historic journey. During their stay, the couple hiked along the Bright Angel Trail, and it was here that they encountered two men who would become crucial witnesses in the mystery that was about to unfold. Ellsworth and Emery Kolb were famous photographers who ran a cliffside studio at the canyon. Glen and Bessie visited the studio and introduced themselves, explaining that they were honeymooners who had been rafting on the river for 26 days. They asked the Kolb brothers to take their photograph on the canyon rim, saying they would return to retrieve it after completing their trip. What happened during this meeting would later become significant. According to Emery Kolb, Glen mentioned that they didn't have life preservers. Emery, who knew the dangers of the river intimately, warned them about this. Glen reportedly laughed off the concern. Emery even offered them life preservers, but Glen and Bessie refused, with Glen saying they could swim anything. But Emery noticed something else. He later said that Bessie looked nervous about the remaining journey ahead. There was another telling moment. As Glen and Bessie prepared to leave and walk back down the trail to their boat, Emery Kolb's daughter Emily appeared, nicely dressed in pretty shoes. Bessie looked at her and said something that would haunt those who heard it. "I wonder if I shall ever wear pretty shoes again." It was a wistful comment, perhaps innocent, or perhaps revealing a deeper anxiety about what lay ahead. Some people who encountered the couple during their layover later claimed that Bessie wanted to leave the trip altogether. According to historical accounts, a man named Adolph G. Sutro accompanied the couple back into the canyon. He took photographs and even rode a short distance with them in the boat. If this is true, Sutro was likely the last person to see Glen and Bessie Hyde alive. November 18th, 1928 was the last confirmed sighting of the couple. After that date, they disappeared into the vast expanse of the Grand Canyon, and no one heard from them again. By early December, concern began to grow. Glen and Bessie had not arrived at their destination. They had not contacted anyone. Something was clearly wrong. Emery Kolb, remembering the young couple who had visited his studio, initiated a search of the area. A small plane was enlisted to fly through the inner gorge of the canyon, searching for any sign of the missing honeymooners. On December 20th, 1928, the pilot spotted something. There, caught in the rocks on the river about 15 miles south of Diamond Creek, was the Hyde's scow. The boat was intact and floating upright. The assumption was that Glen and Bessie had somehow become separated from their vessel and were stranded somewhere in the canyon, waiting on a ledge to be rescued. It had been 21 days since they were last seen. Surely they couldn't have survived that long without supplies, but hope remained. When the rescue party finally reached the boat, what they found was deeply puzzling. Inside the scow were food, clothing, books, Bessie's journal, and a camera. Everything was still there. The supplies were fully strapped in, as if the couple had simply stepped out for a moment and planned to return. But Glen and Bessie were nowhere to be seen. The camera provided one clue. When the film was developed, the final photograph had been taken near River Mile 165 on or about November 27th. Bessie's journal provided another piece of the puzzle. The last entry was written on November 30th near Diamond Creek. So they had made it at least that far. But what happened after that final journal entry? Glen's father, Hyde, was 70 years old, but he wasn't about to give up on his son. He hired a group of men to search the canyon in the area where Glen and Bessie had likely traveled near Diamond Creek. He even enlisted Ellsworth and Emery Kolb to help with the search. These men knew the canyon better than almost anyone. They searched for 41 days, scouring every ledge, every crevice, every possible place where two people might have ended up. But they found nothing, not a single trace of Glen or Bessie Hyde. So what happened out there on the river? The most obvious explanation was that they both died in the rapids. The Colorado River is unforgiving, and without life jackets, even strong swimmers can be overcome by the powerful currents and freezing water. But this theory had a major problem. If they had died in the rapids, why was their boat found intact and upright? Why were all their belongings still securely strapped inside? It didn't make sense. Some people began to speculate about darker possibilities. Perhaps Glen had been a bully who forced Bessie to continue the journey when she didn't want to. Remember, witnesses said she seemed nervous and that she wanted to leave the trip. Maybe there had been a confrontation. Maybe Glen had killed Bessie in a fit of rage. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Maybe Bessie had finally had enough and killed Glen, then somehow managed to escape the canyon and disappear into a new life. This last theory might sound far-fetched, but over the years, some strange claims emerged that seemed to support it. In 1971, more than 40 years after the Hydes disappeared, a commercial boat trip was making its way through the Grand Canyon. One evening, as the group sat around the campfire, an elderly woman named Liz Cutler made a shocking announcement. She said she was Bessie Hyde. A boatman named George Billingsley, half joking, asked her, "What did you do with Glen?" The woman answered without looking up, "I killed him." She went on to explain that she and Glen had fought. She stabbed him, then hiked out to Peach Springs, Arizona, caught a bus back east, and started a new life. It was a chilling confession, but further investigation failed to prove any link between this woman and the disappearances. She was eventually identified as a psychology professor from Ohio who apparently enjoyed playing mind games with people. But that wasn't the only time someone claimed to be Bessie Hyde. In 1992, a woman named Georgie Clark died. Clark had gained fame for her own rafting adventures in the Grand Canyon and was something of a legend in river running circles. After her death, friends went through her personal belongings. Interestingly, people who had known Georgie for decades had never been invited into her home. When they finally looked through her things, they made some startling discoveries. First, they found that her birth certificate indicated her real name was Bessie DeRoss, not Georgie. Then they found a marriage license belonging to Glen and Bessie Hyde, and in her lingerie drawer they found a pistol. Could Georgie Clark actually have been Bessie Hyde, living under an assumed identity all those years? It seemed almost too incredible to be true, but the evidence was tantalizing. A Colorado River historian named Brad Dimmock investigated this theory thoroughly. Dimmock wrote a book called Sunk Without a Sound, The Tragic Colorado River Honeymoon of Glen and Bessie Hyde, which examines the couple's story and all the subsequent theories. He carefully examined the items from Clark's home and studied photographs of both women. His conclusion was definitive. Georgie Clark and Bessie Hyde were not the same person. The two women didn't even resemble each other. The marriage license and other items were most likely just souvenirs that Clark had collected, perhaps because she was fascinated by the mystery. There was one more bizarre twist to the story. In 1976, a male skeleton was discovered hidden in a garage on Emery Kolb's property. Emery Kolb, remember, was one of the photographers who had met Glen and Bessie just before they disappeared. Could this skeleton be Glen Hyde? Had Emery Kolb known more about the disappearance than he ever let on? The bones were analyzed, and the results ruled out this theory. The skeleton was too young to have been Glen. The remains showed high muscle mass, suggesting the person had been a manual laborer. The skull's features didn't match Glen's either. It was someone else entirely, adding yet another layer of mystery to an already baffling case. So here we are, nearly a century later, and we still don't know what happened to Glen and Bessie Hyde. The most likely explanation, according to experts who have studied the case, is that they were lost somewhere in the area of mile 232, about 45 miles from the end of the Grand Canyon. Perhaps they did die in the rapids after all, and their bodies were swept away by the current while their boat somehow remained intact. Perhaps they tried to hike out of the canyon and became lost or injured. Perhaps something else happened that we can't even imagine. What makes this case so haunting is not just the mystery of their disappearance, but the glimpses we have of who they were. We have Bessie's wistful comment about pretty shoes. We have the photograph the Kolb brothers took of them, young and hopeful, standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon. We have Bessie's journal with its final entry on November 30th. We have that last photograph from their camera taken somewhere along the river just days before they vanished. Glen and Bessie Hyde set out to make history, and in a way, they did, just not in the way they intended. Their story has become part of the legend of the Grand Canyon, a reminder of the power and danger of that ancient landscape. Somewhere in those depths, the answer to what happened to them remains hidden, perhaps forever. The Colorado River keeps its secrets well, and Glen and Bessie Hyde are among the greatest mysteries it has ever held.